Poor Maid, sold to an old man for money, but he's a millionaire and fell deeply in love with her. The faint hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the Callahan household. Sophia Callahan sat cross-legged on the worn living room couch, flipping through the pages of an old notebook. The notes and sketches inside were remnants of her plans to apply for a fashion design program, dreams that now felt like distant, unattainable whispers. The heavy scent of whiskey lingered in the air, a constant reminder of her father's late-night drinking sessions. The slam of the front door jolted her from her thoughts. Gerald Callahan stomped into the room, his face flushed, his movements erratic. His crumpled suit jacket hung awkwardly from his broad shoulders, a half-empty flask poking out of the inner pocket. "Where have you been?" Sophia asked cautiously, her voice laced with worry. She knew better than to confront him directly when he was in this state. "Out, taking care of business," he snapped, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His eyes darted around the room as if he were searching for something to anchor him. Sophia closed her notebook and set it aside, standing slowly. "Dad, we talked about this. You said you'd stop drinking so much." Gerald let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cold. "Stop drinking? You think that's my problem, girl? No, the problem is this damn world that chews you up and spits you out unless you know how to play the game." "What game are you even talking about?" she asked, crossing her arms. She was tired of his cryptic justifications, tired of the constant weight of his decisions pressing down on her. Gerald turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "The game of survival, Sophia. And you're about to help me win?" A chill ran down her spine at the venom in his voice. "What do you mean?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, tossing it onto the coffee table. "That's the agreement." Sophia stared at the paper, dread coiling in her stomach. She stepped closer and unfolded it, her hands trembling. The words blurred as she read them, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a contract. Her name was written in bold at the top, followed by terms that felt like a punch to the gut. Agreement for the marriage of Sophia Callahan to Edward Harrington. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at her father, her face pale. This is a joke, right?" "It's no joke," Gerald said, sinking into the armchair across from her. He poured himself a drink from the flask, the amber liquid sloshing as he raised it to his lips. "Harrington's a rich man, owns half the real estate in the county. He's willing to pay handsomely to marry a young woman like you. I've secured a good deal." Sophia's hands clenched the contract tightly, the paper crumpling under her grip. "You sold me to an old man for money." Her voice rose with each word, trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. She couldn't reconcile the man in front of her with the father she once knew, the father who had taught her to ride a bike, who had promised to protect her no matter what. "It's not selling," Gerald said defensively. "It's securing a future. Do you know how much debt we're in? Do you know what Harrington's money can do for us? For me?" "For you," she spat. "That's what this is about, isn't it? Your debts, your gambling." Gerald's expression hardened. "Don't take that tone with me, girl. I raised you, fed you, kept a roof over your head. This is your chance to pay me back." Sophia felt a sob rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't cry, not in front of him. "I won't do it," she said firmly. "You can't make me." Her father leaned forward, his face inches from hers. His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "You'll do as I say. Harrington will be here tomorrow to meet you, so you'd better clean yourself up and act like the lady I raised you to be." Sophia stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew arguing was futile. Gerald Callahan was a man who didn't take no for an answer, especially not when his pride or his wallet was on the line. That night, Sophia sat on her bed, staring at the small duffel bag she had packed. It contained only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, her savings of $312 hidden in an envelope, and a photograph of her mother, who had passed away when Sophia was a child. Her mother's kind smile in the picture felt like a lifeline, a reminder of the love and strength she once knew. She glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of Gerald snoring from his bedroom. It was now or never. Carefully, Sophia slipped on her sneakers and shouldered the bag. She tiptoed down the hall, her breath shallow as she passed her father's room. When she reached the front door, she paused, her hand on the doorknob. She turned back one last time, taking in the shabby living room, the place that had been her home and her prison. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, clutching the photograph close to her chest. Then, with a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped into the night. The bus station was nearly empty, save for a couple of night shift workers and a homeless man sleeping on one of the benches. Sophia approached the ticket counter, her heart racing. "One-way ticket to New York City, please," she said, sliding her envelope of cash toward the clerk. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, gave her a long look. "You sure about that, honey? The city can chew you up if you're not careful." Sophia nodded, her voice steady. "I'm sure." The woman shrugged and handed over the ticket. "Bus leaves in 20 minutes. Sophia sat in the farthest corner of the waiting area, clutching the ticket tightly. She didn't know what awaited her in New York, but it had to be better than the life she was leaving behind. As the bus pulled into the station, Sophia took a deep breath and boarded, her heart heavy with fear, but also filled with a spark of hope. For the first time in her life, she was taking control of her destiny. Sophia stepped off the bus and into the chaos of Port Authority bus terminal. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and pretzels from the food carts just outside. The echoes of hurried footsteps and garbled announcements surrounded her, making her feel small and out of place. She tightened her grip on her duffel bag, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her racing heart. The terminal buzzed with life even in the early morning hours. Business people clutched briefcases, students hauled oversized backpacks, and a man in a rumpled coat muttered to himself as he shuffled toward an exit. This was New York City, the place where dreams were made or broken. To Sophia, it felt both thrilling and terrifying. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Food could wait. She needed to figure out her next move. Sophia pulled out her phone and searched for budget accommodations. After scrolling through several listings, she found a hostel in Hell's Kitchen that wouldn't drain her meager savings. The walk to the hostel was a trial. Sophia kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the strangers who rushed past her. The towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets, and the sheer scale of the city left her feeling overwhelmed. But she pressed on, driven by determination and the fear of what she had left behind. By the time she reached the hostel, her feet ached and her shoulders sagged from the weight of her bag. The building was a nondescript brick structure with a faded sign that read, "Safe Haven Hostel." Inside, the reception area was cramped but clean, with mismatched furniture and a board filled with flyers advertising local events and job opportunities. The receptionist, a young woman with a nose ring and bright pink hair, greeted her with a friendly smile. "Checking in." "Yes," Sophia said, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and handed over her ID. "I booked online." The woman nodded, typing into her computer. "Sophia Callahan, right? You're in room 3C. It's a shared room, 4 beds, bathrooms down the hall." Sophia took the key and managed a polite smile. "Thank you." Her room was small but functional, with 2 bunk beds and a single window that overlooked an alley. One of the beds was already occupied by a mountain of clothes, indicating that at least one of her roommates had settled in. Sophia claimed the lower bunk in the corner, setting her bag down and taking a moment to breathe. She stared at the scuffed floorboards, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. For the first time since fleeing her father's house, doubt crept in. Could she really make a life for herself here, in a city that seemed so vast and indifferent? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before looking at the screen, fearing it might be her father, but it was a message from an unknown number. "You think you can run, Sophia? You'll regret this. Come home before you make it worse for yourself." Her hands trembled as she stared at the text. It could only be from Edward Harrington. Somehow, he had gotten her number. She deleted the message, her chest tightening with anxiety. She couldn't let fear control her, not now. The next morning, Sophia woke to the sound of movement in the room. A young woman with curly brown hair and a contagious smile was rifling through a suitcase on the opposite bed. "Hey there," the woman said brightly. "I'm Emma. You must be the new roommate." Sophia sat up, brushing her hair from her face. "Yeah." "Sophia," Emma crossed the room and extended a hand. "Welcome to the city. First time in New York." Sophia nodded, grateful for the warmth in Emma's tone. "Yeah, it's a lot." Emma laughed. "Tell me about it. I've been here a year and it still feels like a lot. Let me know if you need anything. Oh, and if you're looking for work, there's a cafe a few blocks from here that's hiring. I can take you there if you want." Sophia's stomach tightened at the mention of work. She needed a job desperately, but the idea of facing rejection in such an unfamiliar place made her nervous. "That would be great. Thank you." The cafe was called Green Bean, a cozy little spot tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. The interior smelled of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods, and a chalkboard menu hung above the counter, listing an array of lattes, teas, and sandwiches. The manager, a wiry man named Pete, eyed Sophia skeptically as she handed him her resume, a sparse document that listed a few high school extracurriculars and a part-time job at a diner back home. "No experience as a barista?" Pete asked, scratching his chin. "No, but I'm a quick learner," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Pete sighed, glancing at the stack of applications on his desk. "We'll give you a trial shift. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Sophia's relief was palpable. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Over the next few weeks, Sophia settled into a routine. She worked long hours at Green Bean, juggling orders and learning the art of making latte foam hearts. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to keep her afloat. Emma became her closest friend, a constant source of encouragement and laughter. Slowly, the city began to feel less like an overwhelming beast and more like a place of possibilities. But even as she began to find her footing, the shadow of her past lingered. Edward Harrington's message haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her father wasn't done with her yet. She avoided checking her phone too often, fearing what she might see. One evening, Emma convinced Sophia to join her at a party. "You've been working non-stop," Emma said, pulling Sophia toward her wardrobe. "You deserve a night out." Sophia hesitated but eventually agreed. Emma loaned her a sleek black dress, and they took a cab to the rooftop of the Ritz-Carlton, where the party was in full swing. The glittering skyline stretched out around them, and the air buzzed with energy. Sophia stuck close to Emma at first, sipping a glass of wine and trying to ignore her nerves. But as the night went on, she began to relax, the music and laughter easing her tension. It was then, as she stepped toward the bar to refill her glass, that her life took an unexpected turn. She collided with a man in a sharp navy suit, spilling wine on his sleeve. "I'm so sorry," she said, grabbing a napkin from the counter. The man turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. His expression was calm but unreadable. "Don't worry about it." Sophia handed him the napkin, her cheeks flushing. "Here, I didn't mean to." "Really, it's fine," he interrupted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've had worse." She realized then how striking he was, with chiseled features and an air of confidence that seemed effortless. He extended a hand. "Alexander Blackwell." Sophia hesitated before shaking his hand. Sophia Callahan." "Well, Sophia Callahan," he said, his smile widening. "How about I buy you a drink to make up for your glass of wine? Fair's fair." She couldn't explain why, but she nodded, her pulse quickening. This was the start of something she couldn't yet comprehend, a moment that would change the course of her life. The bar at the Ritz-Carlton was a world away from anything Sophia Callahan had ever known. Polished brass accents gleamed under soft golden lights, and the faint hum of conversation mixed with the jazzy tunes of a live saxophone player in the corner. It was a place where people sipped cocktails that cost more than her weekly paycheck and exchanged knowing smiles that hinted at privilege and power. Sophia felt out of place, but she followed Alexander Blackwell Alex as he'd introduced himself to an empty high-top table near the edge of the terrace. The city lights sparkled below them, a breathtaking sea of brilliance that stretched endlessly into the night. "You're not from here, are you?" Alex asked as he leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of calm intensity that made her feel exposed. Sophia's fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. What gave it away? He smirked, tapping his temple as if to say he had a sharp eye for such things. "Something about the way you're looking at the city, like it's both terrifying and exhilarating." She let out a small laugh, surprised by how accurately he'd read her. "You're not wrong. I moved here a few weeks ago." "Big move," he said, taking a sip of his scotch. "What brought you to New York?" The question hung in the air, heavier than he probably intended. Sophia hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She couldn't exactly tell this polished stranger about her father's betrayal or the life she had fled. "Just needed a fresh start," she said finally, keeping her tone light. Alex nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can understand that. Sometimes starting over is the bravest thing you can do." There was something genuine in his voice, something that caught her off guard. Sophia tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What about you? Are you a New Yorker born and raised?" "Hardly," he said with a wry smile. "I grew up in Boston, came here for work, stayed because I fell in love with the city." "And what do you do?" she asked, though she suspected the answer already. Everything about him, his tailored suit, his air of quiet authority, screamed wealth and success. "I run a company," he said simply, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Blackwell Enterprises." Sophia's breath caught, the name ringing a faint bell. She'd seen it on headlines and skyscrapers. Blackwell Enterprises was a powerhouse in tech and finance, its CEO often described as one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. "Impressive," she managed, though her voice felt smaller than she intended. He shrugged, as if dismissing the weight of his title. "It keeps me busy. Sometimes too busy." Sophia studied him, surprised by the faint trace of weariness in his tone. For all his confidence and charm, there was something about him that seemed lonely. She pushed the thought aside, unsure why it mattered. As the night went on, their conversation deepened. They talked about books. Alex had a fondness for F. Scott Fitzgerald, while Sophia confessed her love for fashion design and art. When she mentioned her dream of studying at Parsons School of Design, his eyes lit up with interest. "Why haven't you applied?" he asked. Sophia hesitated, swirling her wine. "Life got in the way, I guess." "Life has a way of doing that," he said, his voice softer now. "But if it's something you want, don't let it slip away." She looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. It was strange to feel seen, to have someone encourage her in a way no one ever had before. For a moment, she let herself forget the weight of her circumstances, the father who had betrayed her, the old man who still loomed in the shadows of her thoughts. She let herself exist in this moment, with this man who, despite his power and prestige, felt oddly approachable. By the time the clock struck midnight, Sophia felt a strange sense of ease with Alex. It wasn't just the wine, though that certainly helped. It was the way he listened, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. When he offered to call her a cab, she hesitated. She didn't want the night to end, but she also knew better than to let herself get carried away. She had worked hard to protect herself, to build walls that kept people at a safe distance. But when he asked if she wanted to see the view from his penthouse, the kind of view most people only dreamed of, she surprised herself by saying yes. The elevator ride to Alex's penthouse was silent but charged. Sophia leaned against the mirrored wall, her reflection looking both nervous and exhilarated. Alex stood beside her, his hands casually in his pockets, his gaze forward. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that took her breath away. The penthouse was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched out below them, a glittering sea that seemed infinite. A glass chandelier hung in the center of the open living space, casting soft light over plush white furniture and abstract art pieces that lined the walls. "Wow," Sophia said, stepping closer to the windows. "This is incredible." Alex chuckled, his voice low. "It's just a place to sleep." She turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "A place to sleep. This is like something out of a magazine." He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes it doesn't matter how nice the place is. It still feels empty." Sophia's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his words. She wanted to ask why, but the intensity in his gaze stopped her. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the space between them. "I don't know what it is about you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about tonight." Sophia's heart raced as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She knew she should step back, should keep the walls around her heart firmly in place. But for once, she didn't want to. For once, she wanted to let herself feel. When his lips met hers, the world outside the penthouse disappeared. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a moment that stripped away her fears and doubts, leaving her with nothing but the thrill of connection. The next morning, Sophia woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. The events of the night before came rushing back, and her cheeks flushed with a mix of exhilaration and guilt. She turned to see Alex still asleep beside her, his features softened in the morning light. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and gathered her things. She didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. This wasn't her world, and she didn't belong here. She told herself it was better this way, clean and simple, no strings attached. But as she stepped out of the penthouse and into the elevator, her heart ached with a strange sense of loss. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Sophia rushed down the bustling streets of Manhattan, her steps quick and deliberate. The morning air was crisp, and the chatter of commuters mixed with the honking of taxis and the distant hum of a street performer playing the saxophone. Her duffel bag, slung over her shoulder, felt heavier than usual, not because of its contents, but because of the weight of her thoughts. She replayed the events of the previous night in her mind, like a looping reel. The wine, the conversation, the way Alex's gaze had seemed to pierce through the armor she had built around herself. And then the kiss, the kind of kiss that made her forget, if only briefly, about the life she had run from and the walls she had constructed. But it was over now. That chapter, however fleeting, had been closed. She had slipped away from his penthouse before dawn, walking out into the city as if she could leave behind not just the man, but the way he had made her feel. At the cafe, the morning rush was in full swing. Sophia tied on her apron and joined her co-worker Emma, who was frantically juggling espresso orders while trying to calm a customer complaining about the temperature of their latte. "You're late," Emma teased, though her smile took the edge off the words. "Long night," Sophia muttered, tying back her hair and jumping into the fray. The hours blurred as she worked. The clatter of cups, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, and the steady flow of customers provided a welcome distraction. But even as she took orders and poured drinks, her thoughts wandered back to Alex. "Earth to Sophia," Emma said, nudging her playfully as they wiped down the counters during a lull. "What's got you so distracted today? Don't tell me you're falling for one of the regulars." Sophia laughed, though it sounded forced. "Just tired." Emma narrowed her eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Well, whatever it is, you should take a break. I've got this." Sophia nodded, grateful for the reprieve. She stepped outside, the cool air biting at her cheeks. Leaning against the brick wall of the cafe, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She needed to focus, to remind herself why she was here. She couldn't afford distractions, not now, not ever. But distractions, it seemed, had a way of finding her. Later that afternoon, the cafe door swung open, and Sophia glanced up from the counter. Her heart skipped a beat. Alex Blackwell stood in the doorway, his tall frame unmistakable even in the bustling cafe. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, but his dark jeans and tailored coat somehow made him look even more striking. Sophia froze, her mind racing. Had he followed her? Was this a coincidence? She watched as he scanned the room, his gaze eventually landing on her. His eyes widened slightly, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Small world," he said as he approached the counter, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Sophia swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Coffee shops open to everyone. Alex's lips quirked into a half-smile. "So it is. I didn't expect to see you again." "I could say the same," she said, keeping her tone light despite the knot forming in her stomach. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "How about a coffee? Black, no sugar." "Coming right up," she said, turning to the machine and focusing intently on preparing the drink. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind was a storm of emotions. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unbidden jolt through her. Alex didn't move away immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "You left before I could say goodbye." Sophia's cheeks flushed, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Didn't think it was necessary. Alex tilted his head, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Necessary or not, I would have appreciated it." Before she could respond, another customer approached the counter, and the moment was broken. Alex stepped aside, his presence still lingering even as she took the next order. Over the next few days, Sophia couldn't shake the memory of Alex's visit. She told herself it was a fluke, that he wouldn't show up again. But a part of her wasn't so sure, and that part wasn't entirely unhappy about the idea. Her suspicions were confirmed when he returned the following morning, ordering the same black coffee and lingering near the counter as if waiting for something or someone. "You know," Emma whispered after he left, "I think you've got a secret admirer." Sophia rolled her eyes, though her stomach did a small flip. "He's just a customer." "Uh-huh," Emma said, smirking. "A very handsome customer who keeps coming back for your coffee." Sophia brushed off the comment, but as the days went on, Alex's visits became more frequent. Each time their conversations grew a little longer, a little deeper. He asked about her work, her life, her dreams, and though she was guarded, she found herself opening up more than she intended. One evening, as she was closing up the cafe, Alex appeared outside, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Walking home?" he asked. Sophia hesitated. "Yeah, it's just a few blocks. Mind some company?" She wanted to say no, to keep the boundary between them firm, but the look in his eyes, earnest and unassuming, made her pause. "Sure," she said, pulling her coat tighter around her as they stepped into the brisk evening air. They walked in silence at first, the noise of the city filling the gaps between them. But gradually the conversation began to flow. Alex talked about his childhood in Boston, the struggles of building his company, and the loneliness that often came with success. Sophia listened, surprised by his openness. When they reached her building, she stopped at the steps, turning to face him. "Thanks for walking with me." Alex smiled, his hands in his pockets. "Thanks for letting me." For a moment they stood there, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then, with a small nod, Alex turned and walked away, leaving Sophia standing on the steps, her heart pounding. That night, as she lay in bed, Sophia stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, letting Alex into her life. But for the first time in years, she felt seen not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as a person. And that, she realized, was both thrilling and terrifying. The sun was setting behind the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the streets of Manhattan as Sophia finished her shift at the cafe. The day had been busier than usual, with a constant stream of customers and orders that left her feet aching. But her exhaustion was overshadowed by a sense of unease that had been creeping up on her all afternoon, a lingering feeling that she couldn't quite place. As she walked home, the city seemed louder than usual. Car horns blared, Pedestrians jostled past her, and the distant wail of a siren echoed off the buildings. Sophia kept her head down, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck to block out the chill in the air. Her apartment wasn't far, but tonight the short walk felt endless. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Sophia glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowd behind her. Nothing seemed out of place. People hurried along the sidewalks, their faces lit by the glow of their phones or the neon signs of nearby storefronts. Still, the sense of unease persisted. When she finally reached her building, she hurried inside, letting out a shaky breath as the door clicked shut behind her. The narrow hallway was dimly lit, the peeling wallpaper a reminder of how far she was from the luxury she had left behind. She climbed the stairs quickly, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Inside her small apartment, the quiet was both a relief and a weight. Sophia dropped her bag by the door and shrugged off her coat, letting it fall onto the back of a chair. The room was modest but warm, with mismatched furniture and a few personal touches, a framed photograph of her mother on the nightstand, a small collection of books stacked neatly by the bed. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. But her mind wasn't on the view. It was on the text message she had received weeks ago, the one she had tried so hard to forget. "You think you can run, Sophia. You'll regret this." Edward Harrington's words echoed in her mind, as sharp and menacing as they had been the day she read them. She hadn't heard from him since, but the threat lingered like a shadow over her new life. She had told herself she was safe here, that New York was too big for him to find her. But was that true? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sophia's heart leapt into her throat. She set her tea down carefully, her hands trembling as she stood. For a moment, she didn't move, staring at the door as if it might reveal who was on the other side. Then, summoning her courage, she stepped forward and opened it. It wasn't who she feared, but the sight still took her by surprise. Alex stood in the hallway, his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was as commanding as ever. "Alex?" she said, her voice wavering slightly. "What are you doing here?" He shifted his weight, his gaze steady. "I wanted to make sure you got home safely." Sophia frowned. "How did you know where I live?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I asked Emma." Her surprise turned to a flicker of irritation. "Why?" "Because—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "Because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. You seemed off today." Sophia's shoulders sagged slightly. She wanted to be angry, but the concern in his eyes made it difficult. "I'm fine, Alex. You didn't need to check on me." "Maybe not," he admitted, his tone softening. "But I wanted to." She studied him for a moment, unsure of what to say. The truth was, his presence was both comforting and unnerving. He had a way of breaking through her defenses, of seeing the parts of her she tried to keep hidden. "Do you want to come in?" she asked finally. Alex nodded, stepping inside as she closed the door behind him. He looked around the small apartment, his gaze lingering on the personal touches, the photograph, the books, the little plant on the windowsill. "This is nice," he said, and she couldn't tell if he meant it or was just being polite. "It's small," she said, shrugging, "but it's mine." Alex turned to her, his expression serious. "Sophia, if something's wrong, you can tell me." She hesitated, her instincts urging her to deflect, to change the subject. But the weight of her secret was becoming too much to bear. She took a deep breath, her fingers twisting nervously in the fabric of her sweater. "There's something you don't know about me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something complicated." Alex's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He waited, his gaze steady and encouraging. Sophia walked over to the window, staring out at the city as she spoke. "Before I came to New York, I lived in a small town. My father, he wasn't a good man. He gambled, drank, made promises he couldn't keep. And one day, he made a deal that involved me." She felt Alex's presence behind her, silent but attentive. She forced herself to keep going. He arranged for me to marry a man I didn't know, someone old enough to be my grandfather. In exchange, this man paid off my father's debts. I didn't find out until it was too late. When I did, I ran. She turned to face Alex, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. That's why I'm here. That's why I left everything behind. And now I think they've found me. Alex's jaw tightened, his expression darkening as he processed her words. Who's they? My father, and Edward Harrington, the man he sold me to. For a moment the room was silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavily between them. Then Alex stepped closer, his voice low but firm. You're not alone in this, Sophia. If they come for you, they'll have to go through me. Tears welled in her eyes at the conviction in his voice. She wanted to believe him, to trust that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the fear that had followed her here, the fear that Edward and her father would never let her go, was hard to shake. I don't know if I can trust anyone, she admitted, her voice breaking. Alex reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Then let me earn your trust. Whatever it takes, I'll be here. For the first time in weeks, a small spark of hope flickered in Sophia's chest. She didn't know what the future held, but as she stood there with Alex, she realized she didn't have to face it alone. The next few days passed in a haze for Sophia, her anxiety steadily mounting. Every noise outside her apartment, every unfamiliar face on the street, felt like a harbinger of danger. Even at work, where the comforting hum of the espresso machine usually provided a sense of stability, she found herself glancing nervously at the door, half expecting Edward Harrington or her father to walk through. Alex, true to his word, stayed close. His visits to the cafe became more frequent, but they weren't the casual, flirtatious encounters they had been before. Instead, his presence carried a quiet, protective energy. He didn't push her to talk about her fears, but he didn't let her retreat into them either. It was both comforting and unsettling to have someone care so much about her safety. The first sign. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon, just as the lunch rush was tapering off. Sophia was wiping down the counters when she noticed a man lingering outside the cafe. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a hood and the rain streaking down the window. Something about him set her nerves on edge. Emma nudged her. "What's wrong?" Sophia forced a smile. "Nothing. Just tired." But she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her. When the door opened and the small bell above it chimed, her heart skipped a beat. The man stepped inside, shaking off his wet hood. His face was unfamiliar, but the sharp, assessing look in his eyes made her stomach twist. "Can I help you?" Emma asked, her tone bright and friendly. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept the cafe, landing briefly on Sophia before returning to Emma. "Just a coffee." Black. Sophia busied herself at the far end of the counter, her back turned to him. She tried to convince herself it was just paranoia. But when she stole a glance over her shoulder, he was still watching her, his expression unreadable. After a tense few minutes, the man took his coffee and left. But the unease he left behind lingered. The confrontation. That evening, Sophia sat on her couch, staring at her phone. The urge to call Alex warred with her desire not to burden him. She hated the idea of relying on someone else, of admitting she couldn't handle this on her own. But before she could decide, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Her heart leapt into her throat. She stood frozen, staring at the door as the knock came again, louder this time. "Sophia, open the door," a voice called. It was deep, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. Edward Harrington. Her legs felt like lead as she moved to the door. She pressed her ear against it, her voice trembling as she said, "Go away." "I just want to talk," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "You owe me that much." "I don't owe you anything," she shot back, her fear giving way to anger. "Leave, or I'll call the police." Edward laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You think the police can help you? You think anyone can help you? Open the door, or I'll break it down." Sophia's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. Her fingers hovered over Alex's number, but she hesitated. What if he came and put himself in danger? What if Edward was right that no one could help her? Before she could decide, the door rattled violently, as if Edward was testing its strength. "Sophia," he said, his voice growing colder, "don't make this harder than it has to be." Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Sophia shouted, "I'm not yours to control. Leave me alone." The rattling stopped. There was silence on the other side of the door, so heavy it made her ears ring. Then she heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. The aftermath. When Alex arrived 20 minutes later, he found Sophia sitting on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Sophia," he said, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" She told him everything about Edward's visit, his threats, her fear. Alex listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each word. "You're staying with me," he said firmly when she finished. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't just run again. I need to face this." Alex cupped her face gently, his eyes searching hers. "Facing this doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Let me help you." Sophia hesitated, her defenses cracking under the weight of his sincerity. "Okay," she whispered. A plan of action. The next day, Alex arranged a meeting with his legal team, bringing in one of the best security firms in the city. He was relentless in his determination to protect Sophia, leveraging his resources and connections to ensure Edward Harrington couldn't come near her again. Sophia watched in awe as Alex took control, his confidence and resolve unshakable. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that she might truly be free of Edward's shadow. But Edward wasn't one to back down easily. The final move. 3 nights later, as Sophia and Alex returned to his penthouse after dinner, they found the door ajar. Alex immediately pushed her behind him, his body tense as he stepped inside. The living room was in disarray, papers scattered, furniture overturned. On the coffee table, a note written in bold, aggressive handwriting read, "This isn't over." Sophia's knees buckled, but Alex caught her, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice steady, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I promise you, Sophia, I won't let him win." The penthouse was unnervingly silent, the disarray a stark contrast to the usual sleek, orderly space. Sophia sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea Alex had placed in front of her. She couldn't drink it. The knot in her stomach left no room for comfort. Alex paced near the windows, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was sharp, laced with an anger she hadn't heard before. "Double security at every entrance. I want Harrington's name flagged in every system. He's not to get within a mile of this building." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. "Yes, I'll cover whatever it costs. Just get it done." He ended the call and turned to her, his expression softening. "We're not waiting for him to make another move, Sophia. We're taking control." She set the tea down, her hands still shaking. "But how? He's not just going to stop. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants." Alex sat beside her, his presence grounding. "Then we hit him where it hurts. His reputation, his power. He relies on both, and we can take them away." The plan. The next morning, Alex brought in his legal team and private investigators to lay out a strategy. Sophia sat in awe as they worked, piecing together a case against Edward Harrington. One investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Trent, spoke with calm authority. "We've uncovered substantial evidence of Harrington's unethical dealings, bribes, coercion, even connections to offshore accounts. If we make this public, it won't just ruin his reputation, it'll open him to criminal charges." Sophia looked at Alex. "And my father?" Lisa's expression darkened. "He's complicit. He signed legal agreements and accepted funds. We can add him to the case if that's what you want." Sophia hesitated. The thought of exposing her father, despite his betrayal, made her stomach churn. But then she remembered his cold eyes, his dismissive words. "You'll do as I say." He had chosen this path. She didn't owe him her silence. "Do it," she said quietly. The confrontation. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Edward Harrington's office, a formal notice of the investigation into his business practices, complete with a list of potential charges. The timing was deliberate. Alex wanted to corner him before he had a chance to retaliate. That evening, as expected, Harrington showed up at the penthouse. He wasn't alone. 2 burly men in dark suits flanked him, their presence clearly meant to intimidate. Alex met him in the lobby, his security detail already in place. Sophia stood behind him, her heart pounding as she faced the man who had haunted her for months. "This is a mistake," Harrington growled, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can threaten me? You don't know who you're dealing with." Alex stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a man who preys on the vulnerable to satisfy his greed. And I'm not going to let you do it anymore." Harrington's eyes narrowed, shifting to Sophia. "You think hiding behind him will save you? You're nothing without me." Sophia felt the familiar pang of fear, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger: anger. She stepped out from behind Alex, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said. "You don't own me. You never did. And now, the whole world is going to see you for what you really are." For a moment, Harrington's mask of confidence cracked. His lip curled, but he said nothing. With a sharp nod to his guards, he turned and stormed out. Freedom. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. News of Harrington's crimes spread quickly, making headlines across major outlets. His empire crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny, his assets frozen as investigations continued. Gerald Callahan, too, found himself facing the consequences of his actions. Sophia didn't celebrate his downfall, but she felt a quiet sense of closure. Through it all, Alex remained by her side, a steady source of support. He encouraged her to pursue her dreams, helping her apply to Parsons School of Design. When the acceptance letter arrived, she cried in his arms, overwhelmed by the possibility of a future she thought she'd lost. A new beginning. Months later, on a crisp spring morning, Sophia stood in her new apartment, a small but bright space in Greenwich Village. It was a far cry from the penthouse, but it was hers, and it felt like a fresh start. Alex helped her unpack, his sleeves rolled up as he carried boxes labeled books and kitchen. When the last box was placed, he sat beside her on the couch, handing her a mug of coffee. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice warm. Sophia smiled, looking around the room. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head. "You did this. I just stood beside you." She turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper. "Then stay beside me." Alex's smile softened, and he took her hand. "Always." As they sat together, the sunlight streaming through the window, Sophia felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Her past no longer defined her. Her future was hers to create. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. Their journey wasn't easy, marked by betrayal, fear, and the weight of the past. But in the end, courage and resilience won. She reclaimed her freedom, built a future on her own terms, and discovered a love that stood by her through it all. This story reminds us that no matter how dark the path may seem, there's always a way to rise. If you were moved by this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales of strength, redemption, and unforgettable twists. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.